A pack of wolves blocked the railway tracks. The train driver froze when he saw what they were protecting. Winter had turned the taiga into an endless, glistening expanse of ice and snow. Denis sat in the warm cabin of his freight train, watching the vast, silent landscape unfold before him, a sight both serene and intimidating. He was a train driver through and through. He loved the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks, the steady pulse of the locomotive, the solitude of long stretches through untouched wilderness. Today was just another routine journey. The train was heavily loaded, the route led through dense forest, and the weather was clear. But then, in the distance, a dark figure on the tracks caught his eye, sending a ripple of unease through him. An animal? A fallen tree? His grip on the controls tightened as the train rolled steadily closer. With every meter, the details sharpened. There wasn't just one figure, but several. Then it became clear. A pack of wolves stood in the middle of the tracks. Over the years, Denis had seen plenty of wild animals darting into the woods at the first sign of an approaching train. But these wolves didn't move. Their gray-white silhouettes stood like statues on the rails, their piercing eyes locked onto the advancing locomotive. Denis frowned. Why weren't they running? Something wasn't right. His instincts screamed at him to be cautious, but his rational mind told him there was no choice. The animals would move at the last second. They always did. Denis sounded the horn, the deafening blast echoing through the forest. But the wolves remained still. No flinch, no fear. Every instinct told him to keep going. Wild animals always leapt away in the final moment, but these creatures stood firm, like an immovable wall. A chill ran down his spine. Then, he made his decision. He pulled the emergency brake. Metal screeched against metal, sparks flew from the wheels, and the massive train slowly began to lose speed. But would it be enough? His heart pounded. Seconds stretched into eternity. He closed his eyes, bracing for impact, then silence. When he opened them again, the train had stopped. Just meters ahead, the wolves finally began to move, stepping aside to reveal what lay between the tracks. Denis felt the blood freeze in his veins. There, motionless on the rails, was something, or someone. For a moment, Denis could only stare. The train had stopped, the screeching of the brakes had faded, and in the sudden silence, only the faint crackling of frost could be heard. The wolves had not moved an inch, as if they had somehow known he would stop in time. Then, slowly they stepped aside. One by one, they withdrew silently, revealing what they had been hiding. Denis felt his breath catch. Lying motionless on the tracks was a man. His body was half buried in the snow, his clothes stiff with cold. Denis's heart skipped a beat. Then recognition struck him. Stepan Mikhailovich, the old forester. A man who had spent his entire life in the woods, who had told him stories about the taiga when he was a child. Now he lay here, motionless, pale as the snow around him. Denis' instincts battled each other. He wanted to help, but he didn't know if the wolves would let him. They had protected the man from the train, that much was clear. But what would they do if he approached? With his heart pounding, he opened the locomotive door, grabbed a heavy crowbar from the toolbox as a makeshift weapon, and cautiously stepped out. The frost bit into his skin as his boots sank into the hard-packed snow. He expected a growl, a flash of movement in the corner of his eye. But nothing happened. The wolves simply watched him, their yellow eyes glowing in the dim light. Then, as if their duty was fulfilled, they turned and disappeared soundlessly into the trees. Denis inhaled sharply and took a careful step forward. As he neared Stepan, unease crept up his spine. The old man wasn't just lying there. He hadn't simply fallen. Denis's gaze drifted to his hands, bound. Handcuffs. He had been chained to the tracks. The realization hit Denis like a punch to the gut. This was no accident. Someone had left Stepan here to die, whether by the freezing cold or the next train that passed. If Denis hadn't stopped, he swallowed hard. Then he cast one last glance toward the forest where the wolves had vanished. Had they saved him? And if so, why? Stepan stirred weakly, his lips pale from the cold, his hands still stiff from the tight handcuffs. Dennis crouched beside him, shrugging off his thick coat and draping it over the old forester while trying to make sense of his ragged whispers. "They wanted to get rid of me," Stepan rasped, his voice barely more than a breath. His eyes were glassy, but a flicker of life still burned within them. Slowly he began to tell his story. He had been tracking poachers, men he had known for years, men he had reported to the police multiple times. But this time, they hadn't just set traps. This time, they had waited. When he confronted them, they had overpowered him, beaten him, and bound him. They said, no one would find me. The train would take care of it. Dennis' stomach twisted. This was no accident. It was an execution. Stepan shivered, his words breaking apart as he fought against the creeping numbness. He spoke of how he had lain in the snow, barely conscious, unable to move. He had survived the night, listening to the distant rumble of the first morning train, knowing that another would come soon. He had given up hope, until he saw movement in the shadows of the trees. The wolves had come. Silent, watchful, they had surrounded him, their golden eyes gleaming in the darkness. He knew these animals. Years ago, he had found some of them caught in a poacher's trap and set them free. He didn't know if they were the same wolves, but deep in his heart, he felt they were. They could have attacked him in his weakened state, yet they hadn't. Instead, they had stood guard. He hadn't understood what was happening until he heard the howling, an eerie, mournful sound echoing through the forest. Their warning, their call to the wild, their signal to the train. Dennis listened as Stepan's voice trembled. "They saved me," he whispered. Denis's gaze drifted back to the tracks, to the spot where the pack had stood. Wolves, predators, protecting a man, defying every natural instinct, as if they had known he was one of them. Denis looked at the old man, exhausted, battered, but alive. Maybe it was chance, maybe it was a miracle, but deep down he knew. Some stories can only be written by nature itself. Denis knelt down, his hands trembling as he pulled the key from Stepan's coat pocket. The handcuffs clicked open, and the old forester collapsed into the snow with a relieved sigh. Denis helped him to his feet, draped his own coat around him, and supported him as they made their way back to the locomotive. Stepan was weak, but he was alive, thanks to the wolves, who had long since faded back into the shadows of the forest. When they finally reached the nearest station, Dennis brought Stepan inside, settling him in a warm seat and handing him a steaming cup of tea. The old man wrapped his fingers around it, the heat slowly seeping into his frozen limbs. The cold would pass, but what had happened that day would never be forgotten. The police found traces of the poachers, footprints, spent cartridges, an abandoned camp. But of the men themselves, there was no sign. "They've vanished," one officer muttered. Dennis wondered if they had truly fled, or if they had come to fear the forest in a different way. The story spread through the village, but many refused to believe that wolves had protected a man. Was it a miracle, a coincidence, or something beyond human understanding? Since that day, Denis slows his train every time he reaches that stretch of track. His eyes scan the trees, searching the place where the wolves had stood. He knows they are still there, hidden in the shadows of the wilderness. Some say it was just instinct, but Denis is certain. The taiga has its own laws and its own guardians. Sometimes true protectors come from the most unexpected places. This story reminds us that nature follows its own rules, and sometimes the line between human and animal blurs. Do you believe that animals have a sixth sense? Let us know in the comments. Did this story move you? Leave a like and share the video with your friends. What do you think? Was it just coincidence or something far greater? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications